I'll just start by saying hello to everyone. This is the fourth seminar in this series, the fourth and final one. So some of you, I'm sure, were here for previous seminars, but for those of you who haven't been here, my name is Brídín Carroll and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Irish Centre of Social Gerontology at NUI Galway. So we call it ICSG. And I'm the organiser of the seminar series with the support of ICSG. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today for the seminar on the topic of emotionally traumatic or emotionally demanding research. So the goal of the seminar series is to increase learning about research in which emotionally demanding or traumatic topics are encountered. And this has been with the objective of making researchers better equipped to deal with these topics for their own and for research participants' psychological safety and their emotional safety, their emotional well-being. So for those of us in NUI Galway, this seminar series builds on a reading group series which ran in the last months of 2020 on the same topic. So the papers we examined highlighted a number of institutional and methodological challenges of conducting this type of research. And the papers that we examined and others are available in a document under the extra materials heading on the webpage for this seminar. So it's on the ICSG website. So if you go to icsg.ie, if you click on news and then click on the page for the seminar series, at the bottom you'll see extra materials. So that's where the reading list is if you're interested in that. So the seminars have been designed to hear as wide a variety of knowledge and experiences as possible. So in each seminar we hear from, or we have heard from, an established academic researcher who's experienced in this type of research and who has reflected at least once on this methodological challenge in a publication. And in each seminar we've also heard the perspective of a different type of actor in the process. So in the first seminar we had a talk from an early career researcher, a PhD student. In the second seminar, we heard the perspective of someone who acts as a gatekeeper to an often traumatized population of people who are frequently the subject of research. In the third seminar, the last one, which was about 3 weeks ago, we had a talk from the head of student counselling in NUI Galway, and that provided some insight into how research students can be affected by trauma in their work and strategies around this. And in today's seminar, we play host to two experienced transcribers and who I feel like are an often forgotten cohort in the process of conducting research, which can have emotionally demanding or emotionally traumatic topics. So we'll get started soon because I want to make sure we have as much time as possible to hear from our speakers. But first, just to let you know that each speaker segment is going to be about 20 minutes long, followed by about 20 minutes for the speaker to answer questions. So we'll have a Q&A format rather than an open discussion because we have quite a lot of people registered today, so I just think it will work better. So if you do have a question, just put it in the chat box and I'll then put the questions to the speaker. But of course, if you feel the need to add something, you know, to follow up, you can just raise your hand virtually or on camera and I can call on you and unmute you. Today's seminar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the ICSG website afterwards for viewing, as will any other materials or resources that the speakers would like to share. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Nini Fang. Nini Fang is a lecturer in counselling and psychotherapy at the University of Edinburgh. Her work foregrounds lived experiences, examining how the socio-political bears upon the personal subjective. She works with creative, qualitative methodologies in composing evocative accounts of the other and their lived domains. Her teaching pushes for a more politically sensitive curriculum that addresses social inequality in the consulting room. She's a scholar of the British Psychoanalytical Council. She sits on the executive board for the Association for Psychosocial Studies and the editorial board for New Associations, which is published by the British Psychoanalytical Council. She's also the Associate Director of the Centre of Creative-Relational Inquiry, which is at the University of Birmingham. Sorry, not Birmingham, Edinburgh. Okay, so take it away there, Nini. You can unmute yourself or, yeah, and I'll just mute myself. Go ahead.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you for having me and thank you for introducing me to the audience. It's lovely to be here. So without further ado, I will get my talk started. My talk is about imaginal dialogue as a research method in narrative inquiry. Before we ponder what imaginal dialogue is or can be in terms of its potential as a research method, I want to first invite you into my process of how I came to imagine a dialogue in the first place, and how I came to meet Virginia Woolf, who later became my imaginal dialogical partner, and how my imaginal dialogue with Virginia Woolf facilitated the process of psychoanalytic exploration of the self in a difficult, disorientating time of researching into depression during my doctoral studies. It has been a few years since I completed my doctorate in 2016. Only now I can finally appreciate what Helen Zissou said. The only book that is worth writing is the one we don't have the courage or strength to write. The book that hurt us. Writing is writing what you cannot know before you have written it. A book stronger than the author. Once I had announced to my research supervisor that I wanted to look into depression as lived experience, I never imagined myself actually finishing that book. Depression brought about what Julia Kristeva called symbolic collapse. The psychoanalytic task of making sense of the past in the aftermath of depression felt like an impossible task. I was also confronted by a force of resistance in revisiting some archaic, broken pieces of memory that had been tucked under the neat label of depression. The psychiatric discourse is good at circulating and reproducing what I call the no wonder account, which tends to explain depression away through the surface manifestation of symptoms and the causal links to what generates them. The reductionistic reasoning could be heard as, this and that were happening, no wonder you were depressed. However, the no wonder account strips the wonder inherent in the hermeneutic process of transforming lived experiences into meaningful knowledge that one can finally live with. But coming to relinquish the no wonder account is to confront, in Arthur Frank's words, a time without sequence, telling without mediation, and speaking about oneself without being able to fully reflect on oneself. No doubt, I wanted to write into depression rather than about it, to come nearer and nearer to the not yet known. But where do I begin? Where do my wonders lie? After a difficult supervision meeting where I was confronted by my own broken speech that morphed into a harassing feeling of inadequacy, I became increasingly troubled by the uncertainty of whether I would be able to research depression after all. That was the same day I stumbled across Virginia Woolf in the local Blackwells. At that time, I thought it was because no one else was near her shelves and I needed a space. I think now that my reaching to Woolf then at an unconscious level was my searching for, in a psychoanalytic sense, an object which I could relate to. I felt drawn to Virginia Woolf, to that very English name, to what she stands for, as I long for relatedness with my supervisor, who I deeply admired, who, as I reflected upon later, was also an English woman of significant achievement. They had a good collection of Woolf on the shelves, but it was Mrs. Dalloway that I reached out to. Already the title promised me a female character. It was a matter of getting to know this Mrs. Dalloway. I soon found in Mrs. Dalloway a bore. I was too miserable that day to appreciate all her efforts to ensure her party would be successful. I felt an urge to exit Mrs. Dalloway's glittering world of fancy upperclassness. But somehow I was also caught in a need to read on. I was unwilling to succumb then for fear that it might reinforce a sense of inadequacy about where I was. A critical scholarly establishment where people around me all seemed packed with cultural capital. I leaned by the shelves, reading half-heartedly. Then came Septimus, a damned presence, traumatized and tragically isolated. He entered into my mind with a sharp reminder of my own corporeal fragility. The weight of his words built on me until I had to drag my body to the nearest couch and flop down. I grew vulnerable and sensitive to the public gaze. Something was going on in me, but I was not quite sure why or what. I bought the book and I went home. Days later, I announced to my supervisor that I would like to spend some time with Virginia Woolf, who I felt could help me find my voices in researching depression. I was surprised by my certainty at that time, but now having known Woolf a bit more now, I maybe should not have been. Woolf speaks for the reader's intellectual liberty. She says, begin quote, "Everywhere else we may be bound by laws and conventions, but in the world of books we have none," end quote. She stresses the literary value in what a reader can bring. She says, to take no advice, to follow your own instinct, to use your own reason, to come to your own conclusion. On the other hand, she objects to the type of arbitrary criticality that dictates to the author without the least efforts of engaging with the text in relation to the author's time, culture, and uncompromising idiosyncrasies. Woolf urges us to consider the merit and possibility of the democratic readership as one that does not abuse its liberal power over the author, but one that is capable of treating the author as nothing less than an equal, of earning the author's respect by working with and not against their text. She said, begin quote, "Open your mind as widely as possible. Then signs and hints of almost imperceptible fineness from the twist and turn of the first sentences will bring you into the presence of a human being unlike any other," end quote. Irrespective of the starting position of a reader, she prompts the reader to suspend quick judgments and prior assumptions in order to meet the author, to get to know and engage the author in a democratic dialogue during the reading process as an active relational undertaking. She said, one must write from one's deep feeling, end quote. One must then read from a place of reciprocal openness to deep feeling and to what it evokes, stimulates, and challenges, and see what becomes. Reading in this light becomes a reflexive, interactive practice that allows the reader's speaking back to the text as it occurs. As it now appears to me, my identification with the voices in Woolf's text goes beyond the reader's one-sided act of projection and appropriation. It arises as the rhythm of the unfolding text pulls the reader in, taking the reader somewhere far deeper than words. In those moments, reading has the effect of jolting the reader out of their sense of separate consciousness into a poignant series of identification and associative ruminations through the moment the author creates and pulls the reader into experiencing. The reader and the text become united by a shared rhythm. Now, I want to say a bit about what happened in me as I came across the voices of the characters in Mrs. Dalloway that day. "Mr. Dalloway, ma'am," Clarissa read on the telephone pad. "Lady Bruton wishes to know if Mr. Dalloway will lunch with her today." Learning that she has been excluded from Lady Bruton's invitation to lunch, Clarissa Dalloway mutters to herself, "Fear no more," a line from Shakespeare's Cymbeline, which has caught her eye earlier on Bond Street. Woolf describes the shock of Lady Bruton's invitation, which made the moment in which she had stood shiver. As a plant on the riverbed feels the shock of a passing oar and shivers, so she rocked, so she shivered. Fear no more as a line is to emerge too in Septimus' mind, signaling an intersection of two separate planes of consciousness. In a later scene, we find Septimus lying on the sofa in the sitting room after a visit to the psychiatrist. Fear no more, says the heart in the body. Fear no more. The word entered his mind, interrupting its fantastical daydreaming. On the surface, they are worlds apart and never meet in the text, but where they do meet is in the mind of the reader. Through the reader's tapping into the rhythm of the unfolding text to gradually bring together voices that were previously separate, and through the reader's feeling body that gathers, amplifies, and reproduces the intensity of affect as they are evoked and felt by each of the characters. The polarized position I had originally assumed as I first entered into Mrs. Dalloway placed Clarissa's narrative directly in opposition to that of my own, as her troubles to ensure her party a success were assessed on their relevance to those of mine. The perception of the gulf between our worlds rendered me a suspicious reader who brought all the differences to the event of reading, whilst managing just about enough to track the surface plots in which I felt I had no part. However, I was soon to be challenged out of this superficial reading, as the movement of the text tossed me on the tides of affective forces as Septimus' voices arrived, destabilized my thinking process, and stirred pain. Reading on, I became sensitized to the dimension of feelings shared between Septimus and Clarissa, as signaled by their shared passion for Shakespeare's Fear no more. Their separate subjectivities dissolved into possible psychological lenses that I could possess to orientate a particular style of thinking, speaking, and feeling. A linear identity of Clarissa, as initially conceived, became punctured as the eerie quality of Septimus' unhinged realities amplified that of her hidden madness. As my reading of the novel became conditioned and personalized by the shared affectivity, Clarissa's voices began to speak to me in a much more relatable manner. I began to wonder how it has all really been like for her. Who has truly known her, seen her, who cared to? What would she say if she could just say it? News of Septimus' death broke and reached Clarissa. She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. Could it have been her? Been me? She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away while they went on living. I stopped to take a deep breath, to feel my body once again. Septimus' death not only pronounced a private vision of Clarissa's own, his death rippled out of the text and reached me somewhere deep that I did not recall visiting before. Haunting poignancy that was first a feeling. I want to now say a bit more about imaginal dialogue as a method in narrative inquiry. I came to explore the method of imaginal dialogue in response to the question of narratability of trauma. How do we narrate trauma when the intensity of emotional registers disrupted the ordinary capacity to make sense of the experience? Trauma, after all, lives in an intersubjective context in which severe emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it can be held. I was, in searching for voices in Virginia Woolf's fiction, searching for a relational home in which I could come to meaningfully engage with parts of myself that bore reminder of grievous yet disenfranchised losses. The emergence of emotional responses as ignited by relational engagement with the voices mobilized for me a self-reflexive inquiry. What is going on in me? What am I feeling? In relation to whom? About what? And why now? Through imaginal dialogue with Woolf, I was inquiring into compelling mysteries of depression with a revitalized spirit of curiosity and fascination. Often I was surprised, when least expected, by the hidden voices in me that emerged out of the blue. My imaginary Woolf spoke in such ways as if to acquaint me with the hidden, conflicted parts of the self, so we could begin to think about their meanings. I could not help but be absorbed in the psychological complexity her words brought to life for me, as if her voices were addressing me, inviting me to join in and play along. She spoke as if to invite me to wander into the similar dilemmas engendered by the uncertainties between self and others, love and hate, loss and belonging. Her deep feeling called out to me, arousing deep feelings somewhere in me that were eager to be heard. The author's voices gained a personal signification when they are heard in relation to the reader. Her voices pull me along into a joint venture of the two of us, probing into, working through, rethinking the unresolved inner crisis situated in the tapestry of the most intimate relationships in which we were encapsulated. Imaginal dialogue with my imaginary Woolf has been a gift. Apart from offering me the chance to dismantle my preconceived prejudices of the historical author, it also enabled me to become more conscious of the complex emotions of my own. We were bound in a shared, deep feeling across time and space, the same way Fear No More bound Clarissa and Septimus. Her words would not have the same power over me if I had read from a distance. She played with me, perhaps because I had chosen to relate to her, although that is for her to say. Within the creative, relational potentiality imbued within the biological relationship, my moments of wonder were found. As the dialogue flows, a set agenda vanishes, leaving only the desire to feel more deeply, to process more relationally, and to wander more freely, guiding us forward and towards the sense of the true and the meaningful. Relationship ultimately becomes the very way of knowing, the locus of knowledge creation. Imaginal dialogue challenged me to replace the wish for compelling research findings with an underlying sense of reverence for Wolf, the author, and also for my imaginary wolf, for where we have journeyed together. Thank you, everyone. That's the talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fang. So if anyone has questions, please do put them in the box. Okay, we have we have a few people clapping. That's great. Can you see all that, Nini? People giving you rounds of applause.
Thank you, very kind.
Yeah, so if anyone has a question, do put it in the chat box, please, or you can just raise your hand. While we're waiting, I might just start myself. So, I mean, narrative inquiry is not a methodological approach that I've ever used before personally, or that I'm very knowledgeable about. So, and I've certainly never used imaginal dialogue. So kind of forgive me if this question is maybe a little bit basic, but I wonder, do you see a place for, you know, novels as art or any other pieces of art as a vehicle for dealing with difficult topics or challenging topics? You know, do you see, I mean, obviously maybe imaginal dialogue, I don't know, might that be something that could be employed through a piece of visual art, do you think? You know, in an imaginal dialogue with a visual artist or any other type of artist?
I have a few responses to that question, Carol. And one thing I want to say first is that my work, and particularly this piece of work, foregrounds affect and affectivity, because I think the central place of emotion in human psychology. So there's something about what we can use, what we can utilize in terms of evoking and producing the sense of affect in us that we can then try and make sense of. So maybe novel, which is the example I use in this piece of work, maybe a piece of art, music, poem. I think they are all helpful medium, but there's something about coming into relation with this particular piece of work in order to see what becomes brought to life for you and what is the process that's happening for you. So I want to emphasize that you are not going to get the same richness or depth if you relate from a more objective stance, rather than allowing yourself to find your personal relation to the piece of work that really, my preferred word is touch. It really touches you. Something about it really touches you. And it can be more than just novels or reading.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Shirley Chan. She says, I appreciate the sharing of the research experience. I'm interested in knowing about the imaginal dialogue, that how you can manage not to be ended up in a schizophrenic judgment from psychiatric perspective. Patients seem to be charged with delusion of talking to something that they are not surviving. If that's not clear, surely you can unmute and ask, but is that clear, Nini?
It's very clear. I love that question. I do. And because as a psychoanalytic thinker, one of the theories that really touches me, that makes a lot of sense to me, is a Scottish psychoanalyst, Ronald Fairbairn. And Fairbairn's idea centers around this multiplicity of the self. So when we are talking about self as an entity, we're actually talking about different parts of the self that brings alive subjectivity at a particular or at any given time. For example, it might be the rejecting sense of self that becomes activated, or it becomes the needy part of the self, the part of the self that needs to be soothed. So I like this idea of multi-voiced and subjectivity and how they are prone to trigger through life events. So I found Wolf's novel particularly interesting because it has the capacity to almost like evoke a range of voices that seem irrelevant, but somehow they're interrelated. Somehow they speak to the wider subjectivity. So for example, Clarissa's struggle and Septimus' madness, and how they can all make a part of the self depending on who we are engaging with, what is happening, what become evoked in us. So my response is, a schizophrenic reading is not necessarily a bad thing. That might be a more realistic way to conceive human subjectivity, that somehow we are fragmented, and how do we respond to that sense of fragmentary nature of feelings, thought process, model relating is the task. And I think trying to force a sense of coherence upon human subjectivity is where the danger is. And there's something else in what Stella, let me just check the name, Shirley, is how do imaginal dialogue make space for the multi-voice nature of human subjectivity? How does it accommodate that in a meaningful way, so we can look at traumatic events differently, rather than producing or reproducing reductionistic accounts that reduces an event to how we respond to it, how we feel, rather than looking at the more holistic sense of meaning making, thought processes, emotions. And what I try not to do in the talk today was to define what imaginal dialogue is, because I think there's danger in that, because I think we might all have a different way of finding our relation with it, or finding our way into imaginal dialogue and our way of utilizing it. For example, what Carol was saying, we might find a piece of poem particularly pertinent. It resonates a lot deeply, but it has the personal signification for you as a person. So that process is highly subjective and personal. So I try not to define it, because there are multiple ways you can engage with it, you can use it. And for my own doctoral thesis, and which was completed about 5 years ago, how I did it was that I wrote a series of letters to Virginia Woolf, as if I was sharing my life and responses with her about her work. And I found letter writing a helpful medium, because it created a sense of relating. It creating a sense of I was working with someone who I felt gets me, know me, and is open to my responses. So I was able to share my responses with Virginia Woolf and relate to her as if she's an intimate friend, a close friend. And what I found fascinating was that it is this particular sense of relating, this sense of relationship, albeit at an imaginary level, with Virginia Woolf, that ultimately helped me to find a voice in researching depression. So that's my process, but there might be different way you can navigate or find your way into having that or depicting that imaginal dialogue with an object or a person or a piece of work that means something for you, that touches you.
Okay, thanks, Nini. I'm going to follow up. If anyone wants to ask a question, please put it in the box. But I'm going to follow that up, what you've just said, this idea of letter writing to help you kind of process. To what extent, where did you find it difficult to draw the line when you were doing your doctoral study and you were using this piece of work, between what is part of the work and what is part of me processing this work, like how much of that actually went into your thesis and how much of it was just for you personally, and did you have difficulty in trying to figure out where to draw that line? Like, did these letters that you wrote to Virginia Woolf, did they actually make it into the thesis, or was that something that was too personal for you?
I found it a lot harder to separate. I think I'm more skeptical about separating what belongs to me, what's my personal process, and what I actually end up publishing as part of my doctoral thesis, because I think that it has to be quite a meaningful piece of work for me, and my process is such a significant part of that. So I wanted to really make that open and known to my audience and people who come and find it and read it, because I want to show how that process of letter writing can bring up potential pathways for us to think about traumatic events quite differently, particularly when it's a topic about depression. So all the letters ended up on the dissertation itself. Apologies, that's my sensory delivery. My partner is going to get it. I see a hand.
Yes, go ahead. Sinja, is it? Yeah.
Sinja, yeah, sorry. Hi, I prefer to ask like this, not writing. I was wondering, you were mentioning this dialogue as a very positive, transformative thing, something that brought you to new conclusions. But what can it happen that this technique becomes counterproductive and maybe you get stuck in a very negative way, like instead of pushing through, that it pushes you back to the trauma or something like that? Understand what I mean?
We can enter into a dialogue about it, but I think from what I have heard, you were describing something about how the process of engaging in imaginal dialogue can open up a can of worms, and how it can create a new emotional dynamite that explodes in us and stops us from being able to write and process meaningfully.
Yes.
It's an ethical problem with autoethnography in terms of reflexivity. How do we engage with studies of the self as when the researcher is also the researched? And I am not quite sure, because I know this is a series of talks, and I think quite a lot have probably been discussed in the previous seminars, but there's something about how we prepare ourselves in order to enter into that process. And I do not want to talk about it as if it's all unicorns and rainbows, because it's not that, because autoethnography, narrative inquiry, is actually quite a painful process, because difficult emotions emerge in the process of doing it itself. So when I was doing my imaginal dialogue with Wolf, writing her letter where I was sharing my life events with her, for example, parental divorce when I was a teenage girl, and I was sharing that event for her, then I realized that the event hurt me and it cut me a lot deeply than I had realized. So it became a moment of how did I create space for myself in order to feel held in that process? And I think that question might look different depending on who you are, your lifestyle, your personal style of processing. So it might be taking a good long walk. It might be being able to withdraw from the process a little bit. It might be, for example, just allow yourself to temporarily dissociate from the process, but something needs to be done in order to create space and entry for you to come back to that process. And I think pushing through is not a good idea at all, because it can re-traumatize you in the sense. Sorry, can I just come back to this relationship thing? Because I really want to say how doing a doctoral thesis, writing a project on a traumatic topic is very lonely, and it can amplify the sense of isolation which was brought about by the traumatic events. So it has that double-edgedness. And I think why imaginal dialogue worked for me was that it created a sense of companionship, that I wasn't alone. And I'm not saying you can only achieve that through imaginal dialogue, but I'm advocating for the process of coming into relation with the work itself, it might be coming into relation with a piece of paper, with a book, with the author of the text, because it does create a sense of companionship. So I was relating to Wolf as my sister soul. And that process was profoundly empowering for me.
Thank you so much for sharing. It was really, really nice talk. Yeah, that's from me.
Thanks for the question, Sinya. If anyone has any more questions, write or hand up. No, I'm sure if you have any more, Nini, I don't know, can people email you if something pops up after they have time to ruminate on this? Otherwise, we might move on now to our second presenter segment, if everyone's happy with that. Yeah, okay, so we now have two transcribers, Jonathon Foley and Leah Foley, and they're both professional transcribers and owners of transcriptionshop.ie. And they set Transcription Shop up in 2004, and they have a very diverse client base of public and private organisations covering a range of disciplines. So there's 17 years of experience now in this area, and they've worked on material from an extensive range of traumatic and non-traumatic topics. And before I hand over to them, I just want to say that this idea that transcribers would have, would be impacted by emotionally demanding or emotionally traumatic topics was not something that ever occurred to me until we started doing a bit of reading in a reading group last year. And it's something that came up in these papers. And it had never, ever occurred to me up to that point that it wasn't just the person who was conducting the research who might be exposed, that it was other people involved in this process. And it made me feel really bad that in the project that I'm working on, which does have traumatic stories coming up. So my project looks at the kind of life course experiences as in relation to health and well-being of older homeless people and older ethnic travellers. So two very marginalised groups, and people who had some really, really sad stories and really sad things happen in their lives and very traumatic things, and things that I found it difficult to kind of process, and that's what brought me to this topic. But it never occurred to me that as I was sending the audio files off to Leah, the transcriber, that it would impact her as well. And of course it would. So going forward, I think absolutely, if I'm sending audio files off with traumatic things, I'm definitely going to be including a trigger warning, because not only is it difficult for you as hearing it, it's difficult for you if you're transcribing it yourself and you're hearing it the second time. It's difficult for someone who's doing a secondary analysis of existing sources, even if those accounts are really, really old accounts, like from World War II. So yeah, and I'm really interested to hear what they have to say, and people from our reading group are really interested in hearing the transcriber's perspective. So I'll hand over now to Leah and Jonathan now, so take it away there.
Thanks very much, Bridie, and thanks for inviting us along to this seminar today. I have here a presentation, which I suppose I'll go through. I'll share the screen, and then at the end, if anyone has any questions, hopefully we'll be able to answer them. Leah's more on the front line than I would be, so she would be better equipped, I think, to answer the questions, but we'll certainly both give it a try and take it from there. So just a little bit of background, I suppose, about who we are. We're established as Clark Business Services back in 2004. The idea was to provide those kind of soft skills that you might have in an office that people wouldn't necessarily want to do, administrative functions and things like that. But what actually seemed to happen was that transcription was one of those areas. And it turned out that it was an area we're quite good at. So that actually kind of came to the fore, and we created the Transcription Shop on the back of that. The rest of the kind of admin function, I suppose, took a little bit of a back seat. And we've been doing that now, as I say, for about 16, 17 years. We have a team of 15 transcribers, kind of core team, more of about kind of 10. They come from different backgrounds with a variety of different qualifications. Different life experiences. In terms of the actual qualifications education, you're looking at music degree, degrees in international business. I'm a commercial pilot, believe it or not. interpretation, physiology, natural science, archaeology, history, English, Irish, sociology, and media. Some don't necessarily have third level degrees or anything like it, but I think with that kind of broad spectrum of experience, it kind of lends itself to being able to transcribe effectively and produce quality output. So just to touch on the kind of range of clients we have, it's not all research departments in colleges. As you can see there's quite a few, and it's not limited to that list. As you can well imagine, across those disciplines, there would be a lot of content that could be considered as emotionally triggering or traumatic. On Garda Síochána, for example, we do the actual kind of Garda interviews in the interview room. It's not quite like you might see on Line of Duty, but there's some of the content that comes out of it can be quite harrowing. Authors, charities, again, authors write about all sorts of things, true stories, charities, things like that, where you have people who are, in desperate need of help and unable to find it, right through court services. We come across all sorts of, emotional trauma right through all these areas. The medical professionals as well, political parties. Enough said. I think there's a lot of things that people are unhappy with, and they create a lot of trauma in what they do. But TV producers, another thing we do a lot of. TV production. We do subtitling for TV shows. A couple of the TV shows we do are Teenagers Who Kill. That's true stories of teenagers who commit murder, evidence of evil, trace of evil, green-eyed killers. So a lot of very kind of true and traumatic content comes through our office on a very regular basis. The types of transcripts we produce are in this list here. Again, it's really just to touch on the kind of stuff that we output that can contain a lot of this content. There's no escape from trauma. Everyone experiences some trauma or another throughout the course of their lives, whether it's severe things, from anything from kind of like bereavement to extreme illness to right through to alcohol, child abuse, and there's really no way out of that. It's really more, I suppose, how we deal with it. So how do we deal with it? I mean, from a transcriber's perspective, I'm not a counsellor, so I can't really tell somebody else how to deal with their own traumas, but I suppose we can touch on how we deal with trauma and possibly how our transcribers would deal with any kind of content that they come across that might affect them in their day-to-day job. I've put the prism there, by way of, there's always, it's not a Pink Floyd reference. There's always another way of looking at things to kind of bring light. I mean, Nini mentioned earlier on, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. It certainly isn't. But if we can look at things in a different light, you look at one side of a prism and you're talking about white light. If we look at the other side of a prism, whereby you have the constituent spectral colors coming out, I suppose each one of those colors, the way I look at things, each one of those colors kind of represents a coping mechanism, a way we can maybe, deal with that kind of single thing that appears as a trauma, but perhaps each of those colors can represent a coping mechanism and maybe some respite or some escape from that trauma. I've also put here the WhatsApp logo. Our transcribers will deal with any kind of content that upsets them by quite simply taking a break. We have a WhatsApp group. We're kind of like almost like a family, a bunch of friends on the WhatsApp group, and we'll take a break, have a chat, make a cup of tea. The advantage I think our transcribers have is that, unlike a lot of jobs that you might be in, a lot of industries, it's your job. That's what you have to do. Just get over it. It's your job. It's not like that with us. if there's something you're working on that you're not happy about, if something that's upsetting you, stop. Stop, let us know. Somebody else will do it, we'll take it up. Hence the off switch there. You can literally just switch it off. It's as simple as that. Our transcribers aren't given necessarily an amount of work to do. The way we work is that they take as much work on as they feel they can deal with. There are deadlines, but there's no pressure to do any amount of work, and there's no pressure to do any particular type of work. What can we do to avoid it? I mean, there's little enough, that we can do to avoid it, apart from, question yourself, am I in the wrong job? Well, not necessarily. I think each job comes with its own kind of pitfalls and kind of daily challenges. Again, I think the advantage our guys have is that they can stop, they can switch off, they can step away from it. And there is the support network there on our WhatsApp group. We chat amongst ourselves. There's also lots of other ways of dealing with it. To take a break or whatever the case may be. In terms of the traumatic content that we would deal with on a regular basis, the list was so absolutely huge that I couldn't fit it all onto one slide, and I didn't want to put a giant list on several slides. So I created this tag cloud, this word cloud. It was interesting to me that this is an automated thing that just creates this cloud from a list of words. And it was interesting to me that the first and biggest ones that came up were child protection. That's something I think that for me would be one of the more traumatic subjects. Crime I find quite interesting. There's a lot of other areas that we would deal with that, again, one thing might bother one person and it might not faze another person in the slightest. Just to touch on some of them, I don't know how visible they are there, but bullying, harassment, cancer research, we have child protection, a lot around COVID at the moment, obviously. We have death, grief, direct provision, disability issues. Of course, we have all the things that Breeding deals with as well in her research. Homelessness, homicide, incarceration, industrial schools and troubles that go on within those, Magdalene laundries, loss and grief, marital difficulties, miscarriages of justice, things that go on in mother and baby homes, the tomb babies, all that kind of stuff. Murder, paramilitarism, poverty, pregnancy loss, we've experienced that ourselves. Rape, sexual violence, suicidal ideation, suicide itself, terrorism, troubles in the north, victims of crime, violence, war, all those kind of things. So there are a lot of things that kind of come across our desks on a very regular basis. But as I say, how we deal with it is key. And again, nobody who works with us is under any pressure to work with any particular area of content that they're not happy with. So we posed a few questions to some of our transcribers, just on this subject. It's something we had dealt with before, but I suppose we hadn't really considered it in as much detail until we came across this seminar. So just to touch on some of those questions and answers. We asked, have you ever been affected by any piece of work that you have worked on? And I kind of, just by way of a general answer, I suppose, a kind of compilation of the answers that came back. The ones who have experiences of bereavement, loss, grief, COVID will stay with us for a while. When you hear it in your ears and you have to sit there for several hours, because transcription can take, to transcribe 1 hour can take anywhere between 3, 4, up to 6 hours. So you could be sitting there transcribing for 5, 6 hours on one subject. Thankfully to date, no trauma such has been caused or recorded. So, we can be affected by the work, but thankfully it's not long-term. I suppose I would liken it maybe to watching a TV program. You may be upset for the duration of it and shortly thereafter, but because you're not directly involved in it, thankfully you can kind of leave it behind when you step up, walk away and make yourself a cup of tea. General consensus is that, again, as I say, once we move on to the next topic, you soon forget about any of the trauma or any of the things that might have affected you on the previous one. We asked them how they coped with anything that did upset them. And using general coping mechanisms, as I mentioned earlier on, if you were watching a TV show or if you read something difficult, you know, take a break, go for a walk, take some time out, mindfulness yoga, you know, read or watch something light for a change. Again, back to that WhatsApp group. They got on the WhatsApp group. We don't necessarily share what the content of the actual transcript is, you know, because of confidentiality. But what we will do is just say, look, I need a break, having a bit of a difficult one here at the moment. So they share silly stories, memes, little videos that they might have come across in social media just to kind of lighten the mood with it. If you unexpectedly encountered distressing contact, did you notify us of it? Again, it's very rare, but yes, we have been notified. And again, the short answer is stop what you're doing. Just press stop, and you know, we'll take it, or somebody else who is kind of less affected or maybe less affected might take it up. But we would certainly endeavour to, as you mentioned, Brady, in the trigger warnings, we do try to find trigger warnings, particularly if we're doing things that, you know, the titles of which might have, you know, might indicate that the content is sensitive or traumatic or emotional in nature. We would certainly ask the client, you know, is that the case? And if so, can you kind of touch on what areas it deals with? And we would know, based on our experience of the transcribers themselves, whether they should take it or whether it should be passed on to somebody else. How do you feel we can improve how these types of situations are dealt with in the future? Again, the trigger warnings that you mentioned, you know, we try to handle them as well as we can. We're conscious and sensitive to the issues and life events that certainly that our transcribers have made us aware of. You know, we try not to delve too much into anyone's you know, personal life, but we do make it quite clear that there's the possibility that you might come across something that will affect you, that you have personal life experience of, that might trigger emotions that you had previously dealt with, put away for years, and it might bring things like that back up to the fore. So it's helpful for us to know in advance whether that might be the case, and if so, we would know whether or not to pass that work on to that particular transcriber. I have a few poll quotes here from what our transcribers have said about this. This one kind of made me laugh a little bit, I must admit. I think I've become a bit of a robot when it comes to transcribing what might be considered difficult topics. This transcriber has clearly detached themselves from the content, and is able to separate you know, the content that's coming in through the headphones from their own personal experiences. Things like grief and loss would make anyone feel sympathetic toward the people in question, but you know, they would never make me dwell on my own experience of loss. So I would agree with that myself. It's that kind of level of detachment that is certainly helpful in this job. Another one says there was, it refers to a particular one where the interviewee had committed some heinous and violent acts. The sheer lack of empathy toward the victims upset me, but what bothered me equally was that much of what he was saying wasn't being challenged by the interviewer. And I thought this was quite interesting, because not only was he affected by the content of the interview, but was disappointed, I suppose, in how the interviewer dealt with it. And I suppose wanted the interviewer in many ways to kind of step up to the plate and say, hang on, do you not feel any remorse for what you've done, or, you know, to challenge them a bit more on it? But, you know, that's not our role. We can't, you know, it's our role is to transcribe what comes in through the audio. It's not up to us to decide how an interviewer should behave or react to a particular topic. There have been occasions where I've shed a tear listening to somebody's story or someone's awful experiences, but once I've finished the type and get on to my next task, I would rarely think of it again. This is a very common theme across most of our transcribers. Again, it's that detachment. Okay, you can empathize, but you know, you've just done a transcription, now you're doing one, you're going to move on to another one. Some of them will be emotional, some of them unfortunately will be extremely boring. That's the job. Some of them will be absolutely fascinating, entertaining, funny, interesting, engaging, and educational. So, you know, it's the kind of rough with the smooth things, and what we tend to try and do is not give any one person too much of the rough stuff. We try and kind of spread it out so that, you know, everyone has a kind of a fair level of work, and I suppose a fair emotional level of work as well, because, you know, nobody wants to be stuck there doing all the extremely emotional or traumatic content. This one comes from one of our transcribers who admittedly worries about her own health, perhaps a little bit too much. She says, listening to women who are my age with children who are the same age as mine has really driven home the fact that cancer can happen to anyone at any time, and this in turn causes me some increased anxiety. But this is something I'm naturally anxious about anyway. She jokes about this, so it's not a case whereby we're aware that it's something she's concerned about and are passing it on. She's happy to do it, but just acknowledges that it probably will affect her, but in many ways can be kind of therapeutic. Just knowing that other people have similar kind of worries, or that their worries are actually real, and it makes them realize maybe quite how lucky they are that while they might worry about their own health issues, that it hasn't actually happened to them, and touch wood won't. One says here, I've surprised myself by not being too affected after certain files, certain transcriptions, as an extremely empathetic person and feel the need for a deep connection with people. But when it comes to work, I just seem to have an ability to be only in it for the moment, and for the most part leave it there afterwards. So again, that kind of level of detachment, I suppose in many ways there's a barrier. Leah would, in a lot of circumstances, act as the barrier between the content and the transcriber. But then I think there's another kind of barrier between the fact that it's not happening to them, it's not real. It is real, but it's not real to them. So I suppose to put yourself in the frame of mind that it's the equivalent of listening to something on the radio or watching something on the TV that, yes, may upset you, but again, there's always that ability to just detach yourself, and if it becomes too much, just switch off. You know, by way of conclusion, we've learned to deal with and overcome any stress and mild trauma that we might feel when working with emotionally traumatic subject matter. I can't say that we're completely desensitized, but we would still experience a pang of whatever emotions involved, and you know, we've all shed the odd tear. But I think the important thing is we've developed these coping mechanisms whereby we can take a break from it, we can break away from it, or we can just completely stop it altogether. We realise as a team the importance of these stories that you guys are providing us, and the research that is being undertaken, and we recognise the importance of our role within that. It's certainly very important from your perspective and preferable to be forewarned of those triggers of, you know, potentially traumatic information being imparted, and, you know, within the confines of data protection and confidentiality, to be able to discuss anything that comes up in the first instance with another team member. So I suppose that would be kind of our only ask, if there is that kind of content to you, the providers of the content, that, you know, should there be anything that could potentially cause a problem or evoke unwanted emotions, that, you know, we're made aware of it. We're not going to complain if we're not. We will deal with it, but obviously, you know, the more prepared you are for any particular project, you know, the better we can deal with it and the better we can output it. So within our team, we constantly check up that people are okay, that anything that we know is potentially distressing is not having any sort of adverse effect on them. It's not a 9-to-5 job. Our guys can work pretty much whenever they want. They're told the deadline. So there's no pressure to be working at any particular time when you're possibly maybe not feeling up to it, or if the content, is causing you to take maybe a little bit longer to get through it, to process it, and to deal with it. The lines of communication are always open with ourselves and the transcribers, and with the clients as well. And if they're not happy working on a piece, we'll just take it straight back. But we can't, I suppose, we can't do any of that unless we're best prepared, and that's kind of where the content providers themselves come in. So if anything does come up on your end, it's invaluable, when it's flagged. And I think for the most part we've been quite happy, and it's been quite successful to have those lines of communication open. And that is all.
Okay, thanks very much. Maybe if you, stop the screen sharing, and then the chat window can, we have the chat window here. So if anyone has any questions, do go ahead and write them down, or again, you can just raise your hand. I'll start by saying, well, thanks very much for that anyway. And I suppose what I was going to say before your concluding slide was, so is it something that you prefer to be, to have these kind of things flagged? So it is something that you would prefer to have. I suppose it's just easier than, having it come up in the 10th page of dialogue or transcription. But I wonder, do people flag traumatic topics with you? I mean, I know if you're doing things that are from, I don't know, let's say it's interviews from a child abuse, tribunal. I mean, that's going to inherently have these stories in it. But if it's something that's a little bit more, like say again, my example of my project, some of the stories were super sad. Some of them weren't particularly sad at all. So I just wonder, how standard is it that you're warned about the trauma? Like, is that normal among other?
Of late, it has become more normal. I think people are becoming more aware of it, and possibly that's because of your work or your reading groups, or it could be that people, I say a few names I recognise there. It could be that, it is something that's been discussed a bit more within research. But as you say, like, obviously we know if it's a Garda report, there's going to be some level of trauma. If it's medical reports, we know there's going to be distressing, maybe people with life-limiting illnesses and things like that. But there have been occasions that something has taken us completely by surprise. So the file name might be just a surname and a forename. You've no idea what it's about, and then you kind of listen to it. But generally, people will say, "I'm conducting this research about X," and that within that there probably will be some traumatic content or some distressing content or something that somebody might be offended by, or but I suppose it's just our years of experience. We know. I don't want it to sound like we probe into the personal lives of everyone that transcribes for us, but just from chatting to them generally and getting to know them as co-workers, sort of their life events that have happened even since they've worked for you or something like that, and you do tend to try and avoid sending them stuff. For example, the pregnancy loss one, and I'm making this quite personal, but it's the best way to make the analogy, is that I had suffered a pregnancy loss halfway through a pregnancy, and then 2 days later I was back in work and I got a piece about a pregnancy loss, and it really had a profound effect on me at that stage. Now if I do it, I will be a little bit sort of reminiscent, if you like, but now if I'd had warning of that, I could have given it to somebody else to do, but I didn't. So that's a kind of an example. And in a way, I've become a buffer for that, because if I'm told, if I know what to expect, I can know who not to give it to if that was something that was going to affect them.
Okay. And it sounds like you have some really good, you've developed kind of quite organically, maybe some really good coping strategies and support networks.
Yeah.
I wonder, has any of that been formalized? So do you have like an induction that involves anything to do with this? You know, do you have any sort of official, more formalized?
Very informal induction, in the sense that I'll say to people, you know, we do work in such a wide range of disciplines, and the content will be so far reaching. There may be something that upsets you, and if that ever happens, no questions asked, just send it back and say, you know, I don't want to do this work. And, you know, I won't probe it and say, oh, no, why don't you want to do the work? It'll be a case of, right, that's fine. And converse to that, if there's something that I'm finding difficult, I'll say to one of my colleagues, look, I'm finding this difficult. And they'll say, right, we'll take that. And again, they won't ask me. It's private in that sense, but yes. So, but there's nothing formal. A couple of times we have been offered by clients, it was around the repeal the 8th, some work we were doing, they had offered us some counselling afterwards, but to be honest, to date, I don't feel that we've needed the counselling. And as Jonathan said a few times there, you listen to something and sort of process it there, and then it goes again, because you're moving on to something else sort of so quickly, and it's so diverse. But obviously, you know, if it came to a fact that someone was deeply affected and felt they needed counselling, we'd look into it. But to date, it hasn't happened.
Yeah, I mean, and just to kind of, I suppose, touch on an analogy. Yeah, I've been in roles before, used to do technical writing, and I recall being asked to do a piece on a particular area that I was by no means the subject matter expert. And I asked, is there anyone else that would be available to do this? Because it's not really an area that I'm particularly familiar or au fait with. And I was told, no, that's your job. And absolutely right, it is my job. And it was up to me to go off and research and learn a bit more about that. But just in terms of workflow and to produce the best result, I thought maybe I'm not the best person for this, but no, that's your job. And we don't have that ethos here. Yes, that is your job, but it's not your job if it's something you don't want to do. Obviously within reason. If we offer a transcriber any type of work on a broad spectrum of disciplines, they can't say, no, I'm not doing that, no, I'm not doing that, not in the mood. Obviously we won't. We just quite simply it doesn't happen. But there's certainly no questions asked, and there's no problem if there's ever an instance where it's not something that they feel they want to do.
There have also been instances of I've forgotten how I'm going to say this, sort of political bias, the right thing. So a project came in that was about it was about horse racing, let's say. And the person who was assigned to do the work was very adamant that they were against horse racing. It was against their, what am I looking for? Political, their moral
animal cruelty.
Yeah, and it really was against it. They didn't like they were against horse racing, so they didn't want to do the work. And we have never, I don't think we've ever refused work on that basis ourselves. We take it as it comes.
Yeah, and kind of connected to that, I thought it was really interesting, the quote about the person who was saying they got, I don't know, probably more annoyed than anything else about the perpetrator of trauma. So that's something that we came up against in one of the readings we did, this idea that you can be affected by stories of people who've been the victims of trauma, or the people on whom trauma has impacted, but then you also kind of have this difficulty of hearing stories from perpetrators of trauma, and how that kind of adds an extra layer of difficulty, because you're kind of hearing about kind of horrible things that happen, but then you also kind of have to have this there's this tension. Well, so from our perspective, researchers, you're walking this line between trying to just hear a story and gather the data and gather the evidence, and being a good researcher in that respect, and then also kind of keeping your own emotions in check. And so I can understand where
completely impartial as well.
But I can understand where the transcriber was coming from in being frustrated in hearing the lack of remorse from the perpetrator of trauma, but also in being frustrated at the interviewer not challenging that person. So I suppose it's interesting to kind of think of the two perspectives of what the researcher was trying to achieve in not challenging the perpetrator of trauma. I just thought that was really interesting. One other thing I was going to comment on was I thought it was interesting, this idea that, so you guys do seem to be able to kind of move on from the trauma or from the traumatic stories quite easily. And I suppose this is, you know, you talk about this level of detachment, and my theory would be that, I suppose, if you're not in the room with the person, you're not seeing the whites of their eyes, maybe it just makes it easier, you know?
Yeah, a lot of it is as well, though. A lot of our work would be researchers talking to a third party about a traumatic event. So you could be talking to say a doctor who has looked after someone that's had a traumatic event, and they're describing the event to you. So it's almost in the third person rather than the most difficult ones are when it's in the first person and a person is describing something that's happened to them. They are the most difficult ones. But like that, you know, there's a part of it that's sort of psychological. I don't know if you're switching off from what you're hearing, or the sort of the automated work brain part of your brain is taking over, and you're just concentrating on getting the words on the page and not really what they mean. Sometimes that can happen, that you're not. But if you become interested in the story, sometimes, as Jonathan said, unfortunately, we do some quite boring work as well, and there's no story there. It's words on a page, that you're intertwining together. But I forgot what I was saying there.
Certainly, I think certainly when you're transcribing, it's not like listening to a podcast or something like that, of something that's you know, touching or emotional, whatever the case may be. But when you're transcribing, you are actually doing work. So your focus is on getting the words on the page, getting it readable, properly laid out, and, you know, with punctuation, all that kind of stuff. You're not 100% of your focus isn't on the content. Obviously, some of your focus has to be on the content, but while you're doing the job, I suppose that kind of softens it as well. That, you know, you have a job to do, and you're doing that job. I mean, in terms of breaking it up into percentages, it would really depend on whether it's something that has affected you in the past or not. So, you know, a lot of stuff you could be 10% focusing on the content and 90% transcribing, getting the words on the page, and then other stuff that might be a little bit closer to the bone. It could be, you know, 70-30, 50-50, you know, you might become a bit more engaged and involved in it. And I think they're the ones we need to be a little bit more aware of.
Okay, so I don't think anyone else has any questions. So if not, I will just kind of round up by saying thank you very much to Leah and Jonathan for that talk, and also thank you again to Dr. Nini Fang. I really appreciate the fact that you guys have all given your time to us today, and you've been very generous in doing that, and for your great contributions. And I feel like we've all learned a lot here today. As I said, the seminar has been recorded, so the video of the seminar and any other materials that the speakers might want to share, I'm going to make them available online as soon as I can manage it. So on the ICSG page for the seminar series, and also the 3 previous seminar recordings are currently on the webpage. So if you missed those and you wanted to see them, they're there, as are any kind of other supplementary materials which the speakers wanted to share. So that concludes the emotionally traumatic research seminar series, and I'd like to thank as well all the previous speakers we've had at the 3 preceding seminars. I would like to thank everyone who's attended and everyone who's kind of asked any really interesting probing questions. I hope you've all found some or all of the seminars to be useful. I'd also like to thank the ICSG, the Irish Centre of Social Gerontology, for their support for this seminar series, particularly Christine Delargy and what she's done to help me with this. So just a kind of a closing point, as I said at the start, the seminar series came about in response to a gap in knowledge and support on this topic, which we identified in NUI Galway. So I really don't want the end of this seminar series to also be the end of engagement with this topic at NUI Galway. So for me, the next step is to advocate for a number of changes in this regard. And I think I should say as well that these changes, I think, should be happening in other institutions. This is not just something that I feel there's a gap in NUI Galway. So the first thing is that I'd like to see the group of people who came together for the reading group at the end of 2020 and any other interested parties at NUI Galway. I'd like to see this become a kind of permanent and formalised network, which is facilitated by institutional leadership. Second, I think there should be development of a range of appropriate and structured courses of training on the topic. And this, I think the training should be tailored and it should differ according to where your role is in the research process. Third, I think that leadership should be provided to establish a comprehensive and integrated suite of supports for researchers who are likely to encounter emotionally demanding or traumatic issues. So one example could be, peer support networks that could be drawn from a formalized network that I proposed at the start. And fourth and finally, I think it should be a requirement of ethical approval that consideration be had for the psychological well-being of researchers. So you won't, I think, you shouldn't get approval for a project unless you've or somebody shouldn't get approval for a project unless they've put this in as a consideration. So right now you have those kind of requirements for the research participant, their physical safety, their psychological safety, and even for researchers, you need to kind of maybe talk about physical safety if that's something, but in terms of psychological well-being, that seems to be forgotten about. So I think that needs to be embedded. So the type of network, the formalized network that I'm proposing, has already been set up in the University of Sheffield. So if you were interested in seeing how something like that would run, I'm going to post a link to the chat box now for how that kind of network was formalized. Also, some brief kind of guidance papers on the topic have been developed, also in the University of Sheffield. So I'm going to post that one now, if you're interested. Oh, that looks a bit dodgy now because, okay, it's two separate links anyway. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to just type something nonsense in the box to break it up a bit. Also, King's College London have put together some guidance on this as well, which I'll share now. And don't worry if, because I'm going to end the call now in a minute, so don't worry if you lose these links, because what I will do is I'll put them up onto the web page for this seminar series as well. So just in the next few days, I'll get around to that, hopefully. All right, so that's it. I will leave it there. Sorry, somebody is saying, could you type in the website, please? Okay, someone's put in icsg.ie, but I'll also put up the actual page, which has the links to this. Just give me 2 seconds, so that it's just as easy as possible for you to find it. So you probably would have all been on this page before, because this is where the information from the seminar series is. I'm just going to do that again so that it's a break. Yeah. So this is where you'll find, no, that's the wrong one. Sorry, ignore that. Somebody has moved things around on the website. Okay. Just a second now. Okay, there it is. So this is the web page. This is where the recordings will be, where all the extra things will be. Okay, is that it? Any other questions? I'm just going to have a quick look here. No, okay, that seems to be everything. Unless anyone has anything else to add, I'll end it there. No? Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks again, Nini. Thanks, Jonathan, Leah. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
You too.
Somebody's asking, do I have a mailing list? We don't have a mailing list, Zania. But keep an eye on the web page. That will, hopefully we can push this forward somehow. So for now, we don't have a mailing list, but I'm hoping, like I said, to kind of